Hell was dying. The fortress walls that had stood through ages of slaughter were collapsing beneath the force of the Slayer's advance. Rivers of fire poured through shattered streets. Towers built from bone and black stone folded inward as if the realm itself had finally grown afraid of the warrior walking through it. Doom Slayer did not slow. Demons came from every direction, crawling from the ruins, descending from the burning skies, throwing themselves upon him in numbers that would have buried armies. His weapons answered them. Gunfire thundered through the smoke. Explosions tore apart the darkness. Steel and fury moved through the endless horde until nothing remained but ash. Then the sky split open. It was not a portal like those the Slayer had crossed before. This was something different. A wound appeared above the ruins, stretching across the heavens like a crack in reality itself. Beyond it was not another battlefield, not another world, but an impossible darkness filled with distant stars and something deeper moving between them. The foundations of hell began to collapse. For the first time, even the demons stopped advancing. The Slayer looked toward the rupture. He had spent an eternity walking toward monsters. He would not turn away now. He stepped forward. The breach swallowed him. For an instant there was nothing. No fire. No demons. No sound. Then reality struck him like a weapon. He was thrown through dimensions without direction or mercy, passing through flashes of worlds that were not his own. Dead stars. Endless darkness. Strange oceans beneath alien suns. Then he fell. A human settlement appeared beneath him. The Slayer struck the ground hard enough to shatter stone. Around him, buildings burned beneath an unfamiliar sky. Screams filled the streets. Creatures emerged from the smoke. They were twisted things of flesh, horn and unnatural hunger, their bodies warped by the power surrounding them. They moved like demons. Because, in every way that mattered, they were. The Slayer rose. His weapons came alive. The creatures attacked. They died. Within minutes, the streets were silent. The survivors stared at the armored stranger standing among the corpses. Far above them, astropaths across the system screamed as something impossible registered within the warp. A presence had arrived from beyond their reality. A presence that did not belong to the warp. A presence that did not fear it. Across the stars, Imperial authorities began recording the event. Reports were transmitted. Ships changed course. And eventually, the information reached Terra. The Great Crusade had encountered countless alien species. It had conquered worlds beyond number. It had faced monsters that defied human understanding. But it had never encountered a warrior who already knew what waited inside the warp. The journey to Terra was conducted in silence. Doom Slayer stood within the center of the Imperial vessel, surrounded by custodes who had been ordered to watch him from the moment he was brought aboard. No restraints bound him. The decision had been deliberate. The warriors guarding him had been given no device capable of holding him, and none were willing to discover whether force would work. They had seen the aftermath of his arrival. They had seen the creatures he had killed. They had watched him walk through a battlefield that should have required an entire company of Astartes and leave it silent. Whatever this stranger was, he was not a prisoner in the conventional sense. He simply stood there, armored and motionless, while the stars passed beyond the vessel's hull. His armor was damaged in places, scarred by weapons that did not exist in any Imperial arsenal. Strange markings covered sections of the metal. The Mechanicum had already requested permission to examine it, but the Emperor had denied them. For now, the armor belonged to its wearer. The custodes found the silence unsettling. They were accustomed to warriors who attempted to conceal their fear when brought before the Emperor. The Slayer displayed none. Terra itself produced no reaction. He did not stare in awe at the Imperial fleets or the immense structures surrounding the throne world. He simply watched the planet approach and waited. When the vessel entered the palace, the stranger was taken directly to the Emperor. Several Primarchs had been summoned to witness the encounter. Horus stood among them, his attention fixed upon the armored warrior. Magnus watched with a more cautious curiosity, already attempting to understand the strange presence he sensed around the Slayer. Vulcan studied the craftsmanship of the armor from a distance, while Sanguinius remained quiet, observing the stranger's movements rather than his weapons. The doors opened, and Doom Slayer entered the chamber. He walked toward the Emperor without hesitation. Then he stopped. He did not kneel. The reaction was immediate. Custodes shifted their weapons, and several took a step forward. Horus watched carefully, expecting either a confrontation or an explanation. Neither came. The Emperor raised one hand, and the Custodes halted. His attention never left the Slayer. "You have crossed from another reality," the Emperor said. The Slayer remained silent. "I have seen fragments of what lies within your mind." For a moment, the Emperor's words seemed to hang unanswered in the chamber. Then he continued. He spoke of worlds consumed by war, of creatures that resembled demons, of argent energy and an existence defined by an endless battle against hell. He had seen only fragments, but they were enough to understand that the stranger's history was far older and darker than the Imperium's first reports had suggested. Magnus finally spoke. "He is not a conventional psyker." The Emperor looked toward him. "I can sense something within him," Magnus continued, "but it does not have the character of a soul shaped by the warp. His presence is real, yet it is unlike anything I have encountered." The Emperor already understood the significance. The stranger had not been created by the Imperium. He had not been born within it. Whatever force had carried him between realities was something even Magnus could not identify. Horus stepped forward slightly. He studied the Slayer the way he would study a new enemy commander. There was no nervous movement, no uncertainty, and no attempt to impress the Primarchs surrounding him. The stranger appeared completely indifferent to the enormous power gathered in the chamber. "You are not afraid," Horus said. The Slayer slowly turned his helmet toward him. Horus smiled faintly. "I've met many warriors who pretend otherwise." The Slayer said nothing. Horus's expression changed. This was not arrogance. He had seen arrogance before. It was something much simpler. The stranger genuinely did not seem to care who stood before him. The Emperor resumed his questioning. He asked where the Slayer had come from, what had followed him through the dimensional rupture, and whether the creatures discovered on the Imperial world were connected to the enemy he had fought in his own reality. The Slayer offered almost nothing. His silence was not confusion. It was refusal. The Emperor examined him again through the subtle powers of his mind. More memories surfaced. A warrior walking alone through burning landscapes. Vast armies of demons collapsing beneath his weapons. Ancient structures disappearing beneath explosions. Worlds lost to creatures that existed only to consume and destroy. The Slayer himself, always moving forward. There was pain in those memories, but pain had long ago been transformed into something harder. Purpose. There was no desire for a throne. No desire to command. No desire to become worshipped. The Slayer did not want the Imperium. He did not want the Emperor's approval. He wanted only to find the enemy. The Emperor finally asked the question that mattered most. "If you encounter the enemy you know in this reality, what will you do?" The Slayer stared at him. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then his hand moved slightly toward the weapon mounted upon his armor. The Custodes immediately reacted. Guardian spears shifted upward, ready for violence. Horus's expression hardened, while Magnus watched the stranger with renewed interest. But the Slayer did not draw his weapon. His hand stopped. Then it lowered. The Emperor understood the answer. There would be no oath and no negotiation. If the enemy appeared, the Slayer would fight it. Nothing more needed to be said. The Emperor ordered the custodes to stand down. The great doors opened, and Doom Slayer walked from the chamber exactly as he had entered it. He did not bow. He did not ask permission to remain on Terra. He did not declare himself an ally of the Imperium. He simply left. Horus watched the doors close behind him. "What is he?" he asked. Magnus looked toward the Emperor. "I don't know." For once, the Emperor did not immediately provide an answer. His gaze remained upon the closed doors. The Imperium had encountered countless strange beings during the Great Crusade. Xenos could be classified. Psychers could be measured. Demons could be recognized. Even the Primarchs, despite all their complexity, were known to him. The stranger was different. He had come from beyond their reality, carrying memories of a war against an enemy that seemed disturbingly familiar. He possessed no allegiance that the Emperor could exploit and no obvious desire that could be used to influence him. Most importantly, he already recognized the danger within the warp. The Emperor finally spoke. "He is not our weapon." Horus looked at him. "No," the Emperor continued. "Not yet." Far beyond the chamber, the Slayer walked alone through the endless halls of the Imperial Palace. He had entered the heart of humanity's greatest empire, yet he did not care about its wealth, its armies, or its rulers. He had seen hell. He had survived hell. And now, somewhere within this strange galaxy, he had sensed something familiar. The warp was not hell. But something lived within it that carried the same hunger. The Slayer did not know its name. He did not know the gods that ruled it. He did not know the war that was coming. But the enemy had already noticed him. And for the first time in centuries, the darkness had encountered something it could not understand. The Imperium had conquered worlds with armies, fleets, and weapons beyond the understanding of lesser civilizations, yet the Mechanicum found itself strangely fixated upon one man. The Slayer's armor had become an object of intense speculation among the red-robed adepts assigned to study him. Its construction did not match any known Imperial pattern, and its resilience was even more difficult to explain. Attempts to examine it were repeatedly denied. When one senior Muggos finally approached the Slayer and requested permission to remove the armor for analysis, the answer was immediate. The Slayer simply turned away. The Muggos tried again, offering access to Martian technology, weapons, and resources in exchange. Nothing changed. The armor would not be surrendered. Vulcan found the situation amusing. When he encountered the Slayer aboard a Crusade vessel, he studied the armor from a respectful distance, noticing details that the Mechanicum had overlooked. It was not merely designed for protection. Every plate appeared built around the needs of its wearer, as though the armor had evolved alongside him through countless battles. Vulcan recognized craftsmanship in it, even if he could not identify the methods used to create it. Ferrus Manus was less interested in its appearance and more interested in its durability. He examined fragments of damaged plating recovered from the Slayer's earlier battles and found himself unable to understand how the material had survived impacts that should have reduced it to molten debris. Neither Primarch was given access to the armor itself. The Slayer had made his position clear. Guilliman approached the matter differently. If the stranger could not be understood as a weapon, perhaps he could be integrated as a soldier. During a private meeting, the Ultramarines Primarch proposed giving the Slayer an official position within the Great Crusade. He could operate alongside the Legion's Astartes, receive intelligence, coordinate with Imperial forces and be assigned to the most dangerous campaigns. It was, by the standards of the Imperium, a generous offer. The Slayer listened without interruption. When Guilliman finished, he simply walked away. No refusal was spoken, but none was necessary. Guilliman watched him leave and understood that the stranger had no interest in becoming part of someone else's chain of command. The matter might have remained a curiosity if not for what happened on the next campaign. An Imperial expedition entered a region that had resisted compliance far more violently than its commanders had expected. The enemy possessed fortified positions across an entire continent, supported by artillery and defensive systems that inflicted heavy casualties upon the advancing Imperial forces. Several Astartes formations were committed, but the resistance remained strong. The command structure began preparing for a prolonged campaign when the Slayer appeared on the battlefield. No order had been issued to him. No commander had requested his assistance. He simply entered the war. The first Astartes to see him believed he was another Imperial warrior moving through the smoke. Then they watched him advance directly toward the enemy defenses. He crossed ground under concentrated fire that would have stopped an armored column. Explosions surrounded him, weapons struck his armor, and enemy soldiers attempted to overwhelm him from every direction. The Slayer continued forward without slowing. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. He reached the first defensive position and destroyed it almost alone. He moved to the next before the defenders could reorganize. Astartes began following him, not because they had been ordered to, but because wherever the stranger went, the enemy lines collapsed. He fought without formations, without banners, and without concern for legion doctrine. Tactical objectives that would have required coordinated assaults were reduced to minutes of brutal violence. The commanders tried to redirect him toward other targets. He ignored them. They attempted to place him within an Astartes formation. He ignored that as well. Eventually, the officers stopped trying. The Astartes themselves began adapting around him. They learned that the stranger did not need orders and did not seek support. If he entered a fortified position, they followed. If he moved toward an enemy commander, they cleared his path. If he disappeared into smoke, they continued the advance knowing he would emerge somewhere ahead of them. The campaign ended far sooner than Imperial strategists had predicted. Among the surviving Astartes, a name began spreading. The Slayer. At first it was simply a battlefield nickname. Then it appeared in reports. Captains mentioned him in conversations. Legion serfs repeated stories about the warrior who had appeared without warning and walked through enemy defenses as though they were made of paper. Different legions began developing their own versions of the legend. Some claimed he could not be killed. Others said he had fought armies alone on another world. A few insisted he was some forgotten creation of the Emperor. None of them knew the truth. The Imperium had encountered something it could neither command nor classify. He was not Imperial. He was not hostile. And nobody knew what he would do next. The Primarchs had fought monsters before. They had faced Xeno's warlords, ancient machines, and creatures whose physical strength exceeded anything ordinary humanity could produce. Yet the Slayer remained different. He was not a Primarch, not an Astartes, and not a creature of the warp, but every battlefield report suggested that his effectiveness belonged among the greatest warriors of the Great Crusade. Naturally, the Primarchs began testing him. Some did it openly. Others preferred observation. Russ chose neither. The Wolf King never challenged the Slayer directly. Instead, he placed him in situations where most warriors would have been forced to prove themselves. During one campaign, Russ deliberately allowed the Slayer to advance toward an enemy position without support, expecting him either to request assistance or discover the limits of his abilities. The Slayer did neither. He disappeared into the fighting and returned much later covered in blood, carrying the weapon of the enemy commander. Russ said nothing when he saw him, but the amusement in his expression suggested that the test had produced the answer he wanted. Vulcan approached differently. He found the Slayer alone after a battle and examined the damage across his armor. The Primarch did not touch it without permission. Instead, he simply observed the craftsmanship and spoke to him about the weapons he carried. The Slayer remained mostly silent, but Vulcan did not seem bothered. There was something about the warrior that the Primarch respected. The Slayer did not boast about his victories or demand recognition. He simply fought, then moved on. Vulcan understood that kind of strength. Sanguinius was more interested in the man beneath the armor. He approached the Slayer without weapons and spoke to him as though they were already equals. He asked about the world he had lost, the wars he had fought, and the reason he continued after so much suffering. The Slayer gave him almost nothing. Yet Sanguinius did not mistake the silence for emptiness. There was grief within him, buried beneath layers of discipline and fury. The angel sensed that the Slayer was not driven by bloodlust. He was driven by memory. Every demon he killed seemed to carry the weight of everything he had once failed to save. Guilliman approached the problem like a strategist. He began studying battlefield reports involving the stranger and noticed something unusual. The Slayer did not fight according to conventional doctrine, but his actions repeatedly produced strategically valuable results. He identified enemy commanders, artillery positions, and weak points almost instinctively. He did not waste time securing objectives that did not matter. He simply moved toward whatever represented the greatest threat and destroyed it. Guilliman could not predict his exact movements, but he could often predict the consequences. Wherever the Slayer appeared, the battlefield changed around him. Anran found all of this irritating. The Red Angel had no interest in reports or theories. He wanted to know whether the stranger could actually fight. When Anran finally demanded a confrontation, the Emperor allowed it under controlled conditions. The Primarchs gathered to watch, while Custodes prepared to intervene should the battle become impossible to contain. The Slayer entered the arena without ceremony. Anran entered laughing. The first impact shook the chamber. Anran attacked with the fury that had made him feared across the Great Crusade. His strength was monstrous even among the Primarchs, and his blows could tear apart armored vehicles. The Slayer met him head-on. Steel struck ceramite. Weapons collided. The two warriors crossed the battlefield with such speed that even some of the watching Astartes struggled to follow them. Anran expected fear. There was none. He expected hesitation. There was none. He expected the stranger to retreat when faced with the full force of a Primarch. The Slayer advanced instead. The battle quickly became more violent than the Emperor had intended. Walls cracked under the force of their attacks. The ground beneath them fractured. Angren's rage increased with every exchange because the stranger refused to give him the reaction he wanted. The Slayer did not taunt him. He did not boast. He did not even appear angry. He simply continued fighting. Then the Emperor ended it. Neither warrior had achieved a decisive victory, but the arena itself was beginning to fail. The Emperor intervened before the confrontation could become fatal. Anran was furious, yet the Slayer merely lowered his weapon and stepped back. For several moments, Anran stared at him. He had fought warriors who hated him, warriors who feared him, and warriors who worshipped him. The Slayer had done none of those things. That disturbed Anran more than defeat would have. Afterward, Sanguinius understood something the others had missed. The Slayer did not fight because he wanted to prove that he was stronger. He did not fight for glory, rank, or recognition. Even against Anran, there had been no pride in his actions. He fought because Anran had challenged him, and because the challenge had become a battle. Horus began seeing the stranger differently as well. The War Master had watched enough campaigns to understand the value of a warrior who required no orders to identify the most dangerous point on a battlefield. He did not intend to command the Slayer. He understood that would be impossible. Instead, Horus began treating him as an ally whose presence could change the outcome of a campaign. The Primarchs had spent years being compared with one another. They understood their brothers' strengths and weaknesses. They knew what it meant to be created for war. But the Slayer had not been created for their war. He had come from somewhere else. And the question began spreading among them, first quietly and then with increasing seriousness. What kind of enemy creates a warrior like this? The Crusade fleet entered the region under ordinary orders, expecting another difficult compliance campaign. Instead, its navigators reported something wrong with the warp. The disturbance was not strong enough to be classified as a major storm, yet it behaved strangely, appearing and disappearing around the fleet without any discernible pattern. Astropaths began suffering headaches and waking from sleep with the same unexplained visions. Imperial commanders suspected a Xenos weapon or some unknown phenomenon left behind by an extinct civilization. Nothing in their record suggested anything more. The Slayer recognized it immediately. He had seen corruption before. He had seen worlds where reality itself had begun to rot around the presence of demons. The symptoms were different here, but the feeling was familiar. Something was feeding on the boundary between the material universe and the realm beyond it. While the fleet prepared to investigate using conventional forces, the Slayer left his vessel and entered the affected world alone. The planet appeared abandoned from orbit. Cities remained standing, but entire districts were dark. Communications had failed. Human settlements reported disappearances, unexplained killings, and voices coming from places where nobody should have been. The Slayer moved through the ruins without waiting for Imperial forces to establish a perimeter. He followed the corruption deeper into the planet, and eventually the creatures emerged. They were not Xenos. They were demons. The first wave rushed him from the darkness. The Slayer opened fire, tearing through them with the same brutal efficiency that had defined every battle since his arrival. More appeared. Then more. Yet something unexpected happened among the creatures. Some stopped advancing. Others recoiled. A few attempted to flee. The demons were afraid. Lorgar watched from a hidden position. The word-bearers had been monitoring the world for some time. Their presence was concealed from the Imperial fleet, and their purpose had nothing to do with compliance. The ritual beneath the planet was already underway. Lorgar had believed the operation to be secure. The creatures guarding it were supposed to be beyond the reach of ordinary human weapons. Then the Slayer arrived. Lorgar watched him tear through the creatures surrounding the ritual site. There was no hesitation and no reverence. The entities that Lorgar had begun to regard as manifestations of higher powers were nothing more than targets to the stranger. He treated them as mortal prey. That disturbed Lorgar more than the violence itself. The gods were supposed to inspire fear. The stranger inspired fear in them. Beside Lorgar, Erebus watched in silence. His eyes followed every movement of the armored warrior. Unlike Lorgar, he was not troubled by the sight. He was calculating. He wanted to know what the Slayer was, where he had come from and, most importantly, whether he could be controlled. The answer was not immediately obvious. The Slayer continued deeper into the ruins until he found the source of the corruption. Beneath the remains of an Imperial settlement stood a hidden chamber decorated with symbols that Imperial commanders would have mistaken for meaningless inscriptions. The walls were covered with human blood. Bodies surrounded a central altar. At its heart, a ritual was beginning to open a connection to the warp. The Slayer did not hesitate. He destroyed the altar. The chamber erupted with unnatural energy. The ritual collapsed before it could fully mature, and the creatures surrounding it were dragged back into the warp or torn apart by the destruction of their own gateway. When Imperial forces finally reached the site, they found the world scarred but alive. They also found something else. The ritual had been constructed using Imperial materials. Its power conduits had been manufactured by human forges. Its security codes belonged to Imperial personnel. Someone inside the Crusade had helped the word-bearers build it. The discovery was transmitted through secure channels. Eventually, the report reached Horus. The War Master read it twice. Then he looked toward the final section. The stranger had identified the corruption before Imperial censors had even understood that something was wrong. He had entered the world alone, destroyed the entities responsible and uncovered evidence of an organized conspiracy. Horus immediately ordered an investigation. Elsewhere, Erebus received the same news. For the first time, the calm expression of the word-bearer changed. The stranger was not merely a dangerous warrior. He was beginning to see through the veil. The hidden rituals. The demons. The corruption. The manipulation. The enemy that had remained invisible to the Imperium was no longer invisible to everyone. Erebus understood what that meant. The stranger had arrived in their galaxy knowing exactly what hell looked like. And chaos had discovered its first serious problem. The Slayer already knew what it was. The destruction of the shrine did not end the Word-Bearer's operation. It damaged something far larger. The ritual had been connected to a network of hidden cults and warp passages spread across several Imperial worlds, and when the Slayer destroyed its center, communications between those cells began to collapse. Agents disappeared. Carefully prepared ceremonies failed. Imperial officials who had unknowingly assisted the Word-Bearers suddenly found themselves exposed. The stranger had not understood the entire operation, but he had struck one of its foundations hard enough to make the rest of it shake. Erebus took personal interest in him. Reports were gathered from every campaign in which the Slayer had appeared. His movements were analyzed. His battles were reconstructed. Witnesses were questioned about his behavior before and after combat. Erebus searched for a pattern, something that could reveal what existed beneath the armor. Every mortal being had weaknesses. Every warrior wanted something. Some wanted power, others recognition, revenge, pleasure, or simply the chance to survive. Those desires could be manipulated. Erebus had built his life around discovering such weaknesses. The Slayer gave him almost nothing. He did not seek command. He had refused every attempt to give him a formal place within the Imperial military. He showed no interest in wealth or political influence. He did not care about recognition, and the admiration of the Astartes seemed meaningless to him. Even his hatred appeared different from ordinary hatred. It was not something that consumed him. It was something he controlled and directed toward a single purpose. The Word-Bearers were not the only ones watching. Deep within the warp, the powers behind the conspiracy began to take notice of the stranger. His presence had become impossible to ignore. The creatures serving chaos recognized him before their mortal followers did, and their reactions were disturbing. Some demons attacked him with greater fury, while others instinctively recoiled when they sensed him approaching. The dark gods watched through the Imperium, attempting to understand the warrior who had crossed into their domain without belonging to it. Tsench found the Slayer particularly difficult to predict. The changer of ways could perceive possibilities, manipulate events, and examine countless paths toward the future, yet the stranger repeatedly moved in ways that disrupted those calculations. He did not pursue the choices that offered him the greatest advantage. He often ignored opportunities that would have given another warrior power or influence. His decisions were brutally simple, and that simplicity made them difficult to manipulate. There were countless futures around him, but few of them seemed to matter to the Slayer. He simply chose an enemy and moved toward it. Khorne understood him differently. The blood god recognized the violence immediately. The Slayer possessed an almost limitless capacity for battle. He could fight for hours, continue after suffering wounds that would cripple other warriors and throw himself into impossible odds without hesitation. Every battle added to the mountain of corpses behind him. To Khorne, such a warrior should have been an obvious prize. But the Slayer did not fight for Khorne. He did not kill for the pleasure of killing. He did not offer blood to a god. He did not seek the approval of the blood god. His violence had a purpose, and that purpose existed outside the influence of chaos. Nurgle found another problem. The Slayer had suffered enough to break civilizations. He had endured imprisonment, loss, pain, and an eternity of warfare, yet despair had never convinced him to surrender. The promise of an end to suffering meant nothing to someone who had already accepted suffering as part of his existence. Nurgle could offer him decay, disease, and the comfort of giving up the struggle. The Slayer had already rejected surrender long before entering this universe. Slaanesh found even less to exploit. There was no obvious hunger for pleasure, fame, or excess. The Slayer did not seek beautiful things, luxurious surroundings, or the admiration of others. He did not boast about his victories. He did not celebrate them. Once an enemy was destroyed, he simply moved toward the next one. The dark gods began to understand the problem. Power would not tempt him. Pleasure would not distract him. Despair would not break him. Fear would not control him. Even worship held no attraction. The Slayer was not merely resistant to corruption. The methods through which chaos normally gained control over mortal beings seemed to have no place to take hold. That made him an anomaly. And anomalies were dangerous. Erebus understood this better than anyone. The Slayer did not need to defeat the word-bearers in a great battle to threaten them. His very presence was enough. He recognized demonic corruption when Imperial commanders could not. He understood deception that the Imperium had spent centuries dismissing as superstition. If he continued moving through the Crusade, eventually he would encounter more hidden operations. And eventually, he would find Horus. That thought changed everything. Horus was still loyal to the Emperor. He was respected by almost every legion and possessed enough authority to investigate anything that threatened the Crusade. If the War Master began believing the Slayer's warnings, the word-bearer's hidden work could be exposed before it reached its intended stage. Erebus realized that Horus was the critical target. Lorgar ordered the Slayer monitored from a distance. Word-bearer agents followed his movements across the Crusade, attempting to learn where he went and what drew his attention. It was not an easy task. Several observers disappeared after approaching too closely, and those who survived reported that the Slayer seemed aware of them even when they remained hidden. He did not hunt them. He simply knew they were there. Erebus eventually stopped trying to understand him through observation alone. If the Slayer could not be tempted, then he would have to be isolated. If he could not be deceived directly, then the Imperium itself would have to become the instrument of the deception. A plan began taking shape. The word-bearers would create a threat the Slayer could not ignore. They would make Imperial authorities believe that a world was suffering from a catastrophic demonic outbreak. They would ensure that the information reached the Slayer through legitimate Imperial channels. Then they would prepare the world itself as a weapon. There would be no promise of power. No offer of glory. No attempt to corrupt his mind. They would simply give him an enemy to fight. The dark gods watched the plan develop. For the first time, they were not asking how the Slayer could be corrupted. They were asking how he could be killed. The answer would require the Imperium itself. The Slayer could not be corrupted. He had to be removed. The word-bearers did not need to control the Imperium completely. They only needed to control a few pieces of information. An altered report here, a redirected transmission there, and soon an entire chain of Imperial intelligence could be made to tell a story that had never happened. The deception was carefully constructed. A remote world had supposedly suffered a catastrophic demonic outbreak, and the local commanders were requesting immediate assistance. The evidence appeared legitimate. The reports carried authentic Imperial codes, accurate military information and enough urgency to make ignoring them impossible. The Slayer received the report and went to the world. He did not ask for an escort. He did not wait for a legion. He simply departed. The planet was already dying when he arrived. Its cities remained standing, but many had been abandoned. Entire districts were silent, and strange lights moved beneath the surface at night. Imperial personnel reported disappearances and violent attacks, while astropathic communication had become increasingly unstable. The Slayer moved through the first settlement and immediately recognized the signs. The corruption was stronger than anything he had previously encountered in this galaxy. Then the warp storm arrived. It surrounded the planet without warning, cutting it away from the rest of the system. Imperial vessels attempted to approach, but every attempt ended in failure. Navigation became impossible. Astropaths lost contact with one another. The world had become an isolated pocket of reality, and the Slayer was trapped inside it. That was when the truth became clear. The planet had not been chosen because it was under attack. It had been chosen because he would come. Across the world, hidden structures began activating. Ancient chambers opened beneath ruined cities. Symbols carved into stone began glowing with unnatural light. Thousands of bodies had been prepared for the ritual, and the dead were arranged around enormous circles designed to draw power from the warp. The entire planet was a weapon, and Doom Slayer had been deliberately placed at its center. The first demons appeared before he could reach the main ritual site. They came from every direction. Creatures poured from collapsing buildings and tore their way through the ground. Larger entities emerged from the sky as warp breaches opened above the cities. The Slayer raised his weapon and began fighting. The battle became a slaughter. But this time, the slaughter was not one-sided. There were too many. Every creature he destroyed was replaced by another. Demons covered the streets, climbed over ruined buildings and surrounded him from every direction. The Slayer continued advancing through them, leaving burning corpses behind him. His armor disappeared beneath blood and ash, but his pace never changed. Erebus watched from the heart of the ritual. He had expected the Slayer to be powerful. He had not expected this. The plan depended upon exhaustion. Eventually, the warrior would have to slow. Eventually, the numbers would become too great. Eventually, even he would be buried beneath the dead. But the Slayer did not attempt to escape. He moved toward the center. Erebus watched with growing disbelief as the stranger fought through the outer defenses and continued deeper into the planet. Every obstacle became another battlefield. Every wave of demons became another obstacle to overcome. The Slayer was not trying to survive the trap. He was trying to destroy it. Deep beneath the largest city, he discovered the first proof that something was wrong. Among the ritual equipment were Imperial components. Power generators carried legitimate Mechanica markings. Communication systems had been taken from Imperial facilities. Security codes had been embedded into the machinery. Then he found the records. Orders. Deployment schedules. Names. Imperial intelligence personnel had provided the information that brought him to the planet. Some had been deceived. Others had knowingly participated. The Slayer stared at the evidence for only a moment before continuing. The enemy was not simply using the Imperium's enemies. It was using the Imperium itself. He reached the central chamber as the ritual approached completion. A massive warp breach hung above the structure, stretching reality apart. Demons gathered around it while the Word-Bearer's hidden agents attempted to stabilize the opening. The Slayer attacked. The battle inside the chamber was brief and devastating. The ritual collapsed under the force of his assault, its machinery destroyed piece by piece. The warp breach began closing, but not before releasing a final surge of energy across the planet. Cities disappeared beneath fire. Millions died. The Slayer fought until the breach finally collapsed. Then there was silence. When Imperial ships finally reached the planet, they found ruins where settlements had once stood. The surviving population was scattered among the wreckage. The ritual site had been destroyed, and the demonic presence had vanished. The Slayer emerged carrying the evidence he had recovered. He did not explain what had happened. He did not need to. The documents were enough. When the report reached Horus, the War Master personally examined every piece of evidence. The authorization codes were legitimate. The personnel listed in the records were real. The intelligence channels used to send the Slayer to the planet had belonged to the Imperium. Someone had manipulated them from within. Horus looked again at the final account of the battle. The stranger had been sent into a trap designed to kill him, yet instead of becoming its victim, he had destroyed the ritual and uncovered the conspiracy behind it. For the first time, Horus understood that the danger surrounding the Slayer was much greater than a mysterious warrior appearing on Imperial battlefields. Someone was afraid of him. And that meant the stranger had discovered something worth hiding. The enemy was not merely outside the Imperium. It was already wearing Imperial colors. Horus did not send an officer to question the Slayer. He went himself. The evidence recovered from the ruined world had disturbed him enough to demand a personal explanation, and when he found the stranger, he brought no escort beyond a small number of trusted warriors. The Slayer stood alone in the chamber when Horus entered, his armor still marked by the damage of the previous campaign. Between them lay the recovered records, the Imperial authorization codes and the names of those who had helped construct the trap. Horus studied the evidence before looking at the Slayer. "You found all of this?" The Slayer placed the remaining records on the table. That was his answer. Horus read through them carefully. He did not order the Slayer to explain himself, and he did not treat him as a subordinate officer. The stranger had already made his position clear. He did not belong to the Imperium, and Horus had no intention of pretending otherwise. Instead, the War Master asked him to help uncover who had manipulated the intelligence network. The investigation began quietly. They followed the chain of communications from the destroyed world backward, examining every officer, vessel and intelligence station connected to the false report. Most of the people involved appeared innocent. Some had unknowingly passed altered information. Others had disappeared before they could be questioned. The deeper Horus and the Slayer went, the more often the trail seemed to vanish just before reaching its source. Eventually, one name appeared repeatedly. The Word-Bearers. There was no direct evidence that Lorgar himself had ordered the operation, but his legion had been present near several of the worlds connected to the conspiracy. Their movements were difficult to explain, and their interest in ancient religious sites had increased dramatically in recent years. Horus confronted Lorgar. The Primarch received him calmly. He denied direct involvement in the attack and claimed that his legion had only been conducting routine operations. He admitted that Word-Bearers had been present in the region, but insisted that he had never authorized an attack against the stranger. Horus did not believe everything he heard. But he had no proof. And somewhere behind Lorgar's words, Erebus remained hidden. The first chaplain had already destroyed evidence linking himself directly to the operation. Every path that might have led Horus to him had been carefully erased. To the War Master, the investigation looked suspicious, but incomplete. The result was more dangerous than a discovery. It was doubt. Horus began watching his brother's legion more closely. Reports from the Word-Bearers were examined. Their deployments were compared with unexplained disturbances throughout the Crusade. Their religious activities were questioned. Nothing openly incriminating appeared, yet the pattern continued to bother him. The Slayer watched without interfering. Eventually, Horus asked him why. "Why did you come here?" the War Master said. "You could have left after arriving in this galaxy. You could have ignored us." The Slayer remained silent. Horus continued. "You keep finding these things. You keep destroying them. But you never ask for anything." The stranger looked toward him. "Why should I trust you?" The Slayer stepped closer. For a moment, Horus expected another silent refusal. Instead, the Slayer activated a fragment of his armor's memory systems. Images appeared. Horus saw worlds burning. He saw cities filled with people who had welcomed the enemy because they believed its promises. He saw rulers surrendering their defenses after being convinced that resistance was unnecessary. He saw entire populations transformed into victims because they had trusted voices that claimed to offer salvation. The images changed. A civilization died because it believed a lie. Another followed. Then another. Horus watched in silence. The Slayer finally shut the images down. There was no speech explaining them. There did not need to be. Horus understood the warning. The most dangerous enemies were not always the ones who attacked from outside. Some entered through trust. They convinced their victims that nothing was wrong until resistance became impossible. Horus looked at the stranger for a long moment. "You've seen this before." The Slayer gave the smallest movement of his head. Horus understood. Then another thought occurred to him. What do you want from me? Nothing. That was the answer. Horus had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Soldiers wanted orders. Governors wanted approval. Politicians wanted influence. Primarchs wanted recognition. Even those who claimed loyalty often carried expectations beneath their words. The Slayer wanted none of it. He did not want a legion. He did not want rank. He did not want authority. He did not want power. He did not want worship. He did not even want Horus's gratitude. He simply wanted the enemy destroyed. For the first time, Horus stopped thinking of him as an unexplained weapon. He began thinking of him as an ally. It was not friendship in the way ordinary men understood it. The Slayer barely spoke, and Horus still knew almost nothing about the warrior's true past. But trust began forming between them, slowly and reluctantly, built not through promises but through actions. Horus would investigate the word-bearers. The Slayer would continue hunting whatever emerged from the darkness. Neither needed the other to swear an oath. Across the warp, however, the change was noticed. The War Master was beginning to trust the outsider. And Chaos understood exactly what that meant. If Horus trusted the Slayer, Horus might never become theirs. The campaign on Davin began as another victory for the Great Crusade. The moon had resisted Imperial compliance, and Horus had personally taken command of the operation. His forces descended with the confidence of an army that had conquered worlds before, expecting resistance but not disaster. The battle was fierce, yet nothing initially suggested that Davin would become anything more than another name in the War Master's campaign record. Then Erebus moved. The word-bearers had been waiting for an opportunity, and the time had finally come. Their plans had been delayed by the Slayer's interference, but they had not been abandoned. The stranger had made the original scheme more difficult, not impossible. If Horus could not be corrupted through a slow process of manipulation, then the word-bearers would force the process forward before the Slayer could understand what was happening. During the fighting, Horus was struck by an anatheme. The weapon appeared simple, but the wound it created was anything but ordinary. At first, the War Master remained standing. He continued directing his forces and refused to allow the injury to interfere with the campaign. Then his condition changed. The wound darkened, his strength began to disappear and his body developed symptoms that Imperial physicians could not explain. Every treatment failed. Even the most advanced medical technology available to the Legion could not stop the deterioration. The Mournival became desperate. They had watched their War Master survive battles that should have killed him. They had seen him endure injuries that would have destroyed lesser warriors. Yet this wound was different. His condition worsened with every passing hour, and none of the Legion's healers could identify a reliable cure. As the situation became more desperate, the word-bearers offered an answer. They spoke of the Serpent Lodge. According to their information, the Lodge possessed ancient knowledge capable of treating wounds that Imperial medicine could not understand. The proposal was presented as a final chance to save Horus. The Mournival had few alternatives. Their War Master was dying, and the people offering help appeared to possess the one thing they needed. The Slayer did not believe them. When he received the reports, something about the circumstances immediately disturbed him. He had seen this pattern before. In his own reality, hell had rarely approached its victims openly at first. It offered solutions. It created desperation, then appeared with the answer. The victim believed he was accepting salvation when he was actually opening the door himself. The anatheme. The mysterious illness. The sudden appearance of the Serpent Lodge. The involvement of the word-bearers. The Slayer did not know the full history of Davin, but he recognized the shape of the trap. He moved toward the moon. By the time he arrived, Horus had already been taken to the lodge. The structure stood surrounded by darkness and unnatural mist. The air was saturated with warp energy, and the deeper the Slayer moved, the stronger the corruption became. He entered without waiting for permission. The first demons attacked almost immediately. They came through the walls and rose from the ground, their forms twisting between physical bodies and creatures of the Imperium. The Slayer answered with violence. He pushed through them, destroying every creature that attempted to block his path. The corridors became a battlefield. Stone shattered beneath his weapons, demonic blood covered the floors and the walls seemed to tremble as the ritual surrounding Horus grew stronger. The defenders increased in number. The Slayer continued forward. He did not know how far Horus had already been taken. He did not know whether the Warmaster was still alive. He only knew that something was trying to reach him before he could. Then the lodge ceased to obey the laws of reality. The corridor ahead stretched impossibly far. The walls became shadows. The floor disappeared. The Slayer stepped forward and found himself somewhere else. The warp had opened around him. Chaos recognized him immediately. It had attempted to study him before. Now it attempted something more direct. If power could not tempt him, perhaps memory could break him. The darkness around him changed, revealing fragments of his past. He saw worlds he had failed to save. He saw people he had loved. He saw the devastation that had followed them. He saw the armies of hell advancing across ruined civilizations. Then he saw himself. Again and again. A warrior walking alone. A warrior buried beneath demons. A warrior rising from the dead. The visions changed constantly, each one designed to force him to stop and remember. Chaos showed him every loss it could find, every moment of anger, every wound and every failure. It tried to convince him that his war had already consumed everything he once cared about. The Slayer kept walking. He did not fight the visions. He did not argue with them. He did not deny what he had suffered. He simply refused to give them control. The dead remained dead. The past could not be changed. The memories could not become weapons unless he allowed them to. The warp increased its assault. Hell appeared around him. Then his own world. Then worlds that had never existed. Every possible nightmare was placed before him, yet the Slayer continued toward the only thing that mattered. Horus. Eventually, the visions changed again. The Slayer found the Warmaster standing within a vast landscape of darkness. Horus was surrounded by images of the future. He saw the Emperor. He saw Terra. He saw the Primarchs turning against one another. He saw humanity burning beneath a war that seemed inevitable. Chaos spoke through the vision. It told him that the Emperor had deceived him. It showed him secrets that had been hidden from the Primarchs. It showed him a future where Horus would become the only man powerful enough to save humanity from his father's plans. The Warmaster listened. His anger was real. His doubts were real. That was what made the deception so dangerous. Chaos did not need to invent every lie. It only needed to take the truth and twist it. Horus looked toward the Slayer. The stranger had finally reached him. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Horus asked the question he had asked before. What do I do? The Slayer looked at the vision surrounding them. He had seen this kind of deception before. He knew what Chaos wanted. It wanted Horus to believe that his choice had already been made for him. It wanted him to believe that betrayal was inevitable, that the future was fixed and that the only remaining decision was whether he would accept the power being offered. The Slayer stepped closer. Choose for yourself. Horus stared at him. That was all. The Slayer did not tell him to trust the Emperor. He did not tell him that the visions were false. He did not claim to know the future better than Horus. He would not make the decision for another warrior. The choice had to belong to Horus. The Warmaster looked again at the future displayed before him. For the first time, he noticed what the Slayer had understood from the beginning. Every vision demanded something from him. Every promise came with a price. Every answer had already been prepared. Chaos was not showing him the future. It was offering him a future. And it wanted him to choose the one it had prepared. Horus turned away from the visions. The darkness around them trembled. The ritual began to collapse. The Slayer remained beside him, silent and unmoved. He had reached the War Master. He had exposed the deception. But he had not rescued Horus. That decision belonged to Horus alone. Horus stood within the vision while the future unfolded around him. He saw Terra burning beneath unfamiliar skies. He saw armies bearing the symbols of his brothers fighting one another across worlds that had once belonged to the Great Crusade. He saw the Emperor seated upon a throne of unimaginable power, surrounded by secrets that had been kept from the Primarchs for reasons Horus could not understand. Every revelation fed the same wound that had already existed inside him, the suspicion that his father had never truly trusted him. The vision showed him more. He saw himself abandoned. He saw his brothers turning against him. He saw the Emperor withdrawing from the crusade while Horus carried its burdens. He saw the War Master blamed for failures he had not caused, then discarded when he was no longer useful. He watched a future in which his loyalty became a weakness and his devotion was repaid with betrayal. Horus felt the anger rising within him. It was not manufactured. That was what made the deception so powerful. He had genuine reasons to question his father's secrecy. The Emperor had withheld knowledge from the Primarchs. He had left many truths unexplained. Horus had spent years commanding humanity's armies while knowing that his father possessed knowledge he was not allowed to share. The vision did not need to invent those doubts. It only needed to give them a direction. Then chaos offered him an answer. Power. Not simple military power, but something greater. The entities surrounding the vision promised Horus the ability to reshape humanity itself. He could prevent the wars he had witnessed. He could free mankind from the Emperor's secrecy. He could unite the Primarchs beneath a new order and ensure that humanity would never again be manipulated from above. All he had to do was accept. Horus looked toward the figures surrounding him. The Slayer did not. He had already understood what they were. The stranger raised his weapon and attacked. The vision erupted into violence. Demonic entities appeared around Horus, their forms twisting as they attempted to protect the illusion. The Slayer tore through them one after another. He did not attempt to destroy the vision itself. He knew he could not erase what Horus had seen, and he would not pretend that killing the creatures could undo the War Master's doubts. The Slayer was destroying the prison. The choice remained with Horus. One demon lunged toward him. The Slayer intercepted it and drove it into the ground. Another appeared behind Horus. It died before reaching him. The vision shook as more creatures emerged, but the Slayer continued fighting through them, opening a path while Horus watched the future collapse around him. Then Horus noticed something. The vision had shown him the Emperor's secrecy. But it had not shown him why. It had shown him betrayal. But never the events that supposedly caused it. It had shown him abandonment. But never the decisions that led to it. Every revelation had been selected. Every memory had been arranged. Every future had been presented from exactly the angle that would produce the desired emotion. Horus remembered the Slayer's warning. Enemies that manipulated through trust. Enemies that did not need to invent an entire lie. Enemies that only needed to take something true and place it beside something false. The War Master looked again at the future. His anger remained. His doubts remained. But now he could see the hand guiding them. Chaos had not created his resentment. It had discovered it. Then it had fed it. Horus finally understood the real purpose of the vision. Chaos did not need his loyalty. It wanted his anger. It wanted him to believe that his pain justified whatever came next. It wanted him to believe that becoming its weapon was the same as becoming his own master. Horus looked at the entities surrounding him. You never wanted to save humanity. The creatures recoiled. You wanted me angry. The vision began to fracture. You wanted me to believe the choice was mine. The Slayer continued cutting through the remaining demons. Horus stepped forward. I refuse. The reaction was immediate. The warp screamed. The entities surrounding him collapsed into monstrous forms as the illusion began tearing itself apart. The future they had shown him shattered into fragments. Terra disappeared. His brothers vanished. The Emperor's throne dissolved into darkness. For the first time, Erebus felt fear. He had been watching the ritual from the material world, certain that the final stage of the plan was already complete. Horus had entered the vision. The poison had reached his mind. The dark gods had shown him exactly what he needed to see. Then the connection began collapsing. Erebus realized what had happened. The War Master had seen everything. And he had rejected it. The ritual failed. The warp recoiled violently from Davin, ripping apart the chamber and destroying the structures surrounding it. The Slayer fought his way back toward reality while Horus was thrown from the collapsing vision. The connection between the War Master and Chaos broke before the Dark Gods could establish the control they needed. Horus fell. The Slayer caught him before he struck the ground. For several seconds, the War Master did not move. Then he breathed. Alive. The ritual had failed. Horus awakened later aboard his flagship. The first thing he remembered was the vision. The second was the Slayer. He understood immediately that something inside him had changed. The anger remained. The questions remained. The Emperor's secrecy had not suddenly become acceptable simply because Chaos had attempted to exploit it. But Horus was no longer blind. Chaos was real. The enemy was already inside the Imperium. And someone had deliberately attempted to turn him against his father. Horus rose from his bed and looked toward the stars beyond the observation deck. He remained loyal to the Emperor. Not because his doubts had disappeared. Not because he had forgotten what he had seen. He remained loyal because the decision was finally his. Across the ship, the Slayer stood in silence. Horus approached him. You were right. The Slayer said nothing. Horus looked back toward the stars. I saw the future they wanted me to choose. He paused. And I refused. Far away, Erebus understood that the greatest deception the word-bearers had ever prepared had failed. The War Master had seen the future. And he had chosen not to become part of it. Horus did not announce what had happened on Davin. He returned to the fleet carrying a truth that was too dangerous to place in ordinary reports. The word-bearers had attempted to corrupt him, demons had entered his mind and the powers behind them had shown him a future designed to turn him against his father. If the information spread without preparation, it could cause exactly the panic Chaos wanted. So Horus went to Terra in secret. The Emperor received him without ceremony. For several moments, father and son simply stood facing one another. Horus had spent years commanding the Great Crusade, but now he found himself struggling to explain what he had witnessed. Eventually, he told his father everything. The anatheme. The Serpent Lodge. The ritual. The visions. The demons. The promises made to him. And finally, the Slayer's warning. The Emperor listened without interruption. When Horus finished, the room remained silent. The Emperor already knew that the warp was dangerous. He knew that entities existed within it, and he had spent millennia preparing humanity to survive their influence. But Horus had brought him something different. Evidence that Chaos had been manipulating imperial institutions from within the Crusade itself. The Emperor asked to see the memories. Horus showed him what he had witnessed. The visions were not simply lies. They had been constructed from truths. The Emperor saw his own secrecy reflected back at him. He saw the isolation it had created among the Primarchs. He saw how easily genuine resentment could be transformed into a weapon when the truth was withheld for too long. Malcador was present when Horus finished. The Sigillite remained unusually quiet. Then he warned them both of the danger. If the existence of chaos was suddenly revealed to the Imperium, the consequences could be catastrophic. Billions of citizens had been taught that superstition and religious belief were remnants of humanity's primitive past. The Great Crusade had been built upon rationalism and imperial truth. Revealing that ancient gods actually existed within the warp could destabilize worlds faster than any military rebellion. Horus disagreed. Then ignorance is already more dangerous. The Emperor looked toward his son. Horus continued. He explained that secrecy had not prevented chaos from spreading. It had made its work easier. Imperial commanders could not recognize demonic corruption because they had never been taught to look for it. Soldiers could be manipulated because they did not understand the enemy. Even Primarchs could be deceived because the truth had been deliberately kept from them. The Emperor did not answer immediately. He had spent centuries believing that humanity could be protected from chaos by controlling knowledge of it. Now he was being forced to consider the possibility that ignorance had become another weakness. Eventually, he agreed. The word-bearers would be investigated. Not publicly. Not yet. The investigation began quietly. Loyalist forces received sealed orders and began monitoring Lorgar's legion. Their deployments were examined. Their communications were intercepted. Their movements were compared against reports of unexplained warp disturbances and cult activity. At first, nothing obvious appeared. The word-bearers were careful. Erebus had already anticipated the possibility that something had gone wrong on Davin. When reports began arriving that Horus was alive and that the Emperor had summoned him privately, he understood that the timetable had changed. He attempted to accelerate the rebellion. Messages were sent. Agents were activated. Hidden cults were ordered to prepare. The word-bearers began contacting other legions, searching for Primarchs who might already possess grievances that could be turned against the Emperor. The original plan had depended upon time. Time to isolate Horus. Time to manipulate his brothers. Time to prepare the legions for civil war. That time was disappearing. Fragments of the truth began reaching the other Primarchs. Some learned that Horus had nearly died because of a demonic ritual. Others discovered that the word-bearers had been conducting secret religious activities. A few received only vague warnings that the Emperor believed an enemy was operating from within the Imperium. The reactions were divided. Sanguinius believed Horus. Vulcan believed that something had happened on Davin that could no longer be dismissed. Guilliman demanded evidence. Russ became suspicious of everyone. Others were less certain. Some Primarchs wondered whether the Emperor was simply beginning another layer of manipulation. If their father had hidden the existence of chaos for so long, how could they know that the new revelations were not another carefully controlled deception? The Emperor understood the danger. The truth was spreading, but not cleanly. Trust was becoming complicated. Yet this was precisely what chaos had feared. The Primarchs were questioning everything before chaos could provide the answers for them. Lorgar eventually understood that the original timetable was finished. Horus had not fallen. The Emperor knew chaos existed. The word-bearers were being watched. The other Primarchs were becoming suspicious. Erebus had lost the one opportunity that mattered most. Without Horus, there could be no unified rebellion on the scale they had planned. The legions could not simply be turned against one another overnight. The War Master remained loyal, and his authority remained intact. Chaos could still strike. It could still corrupt individuals. It could still create wars, cults and demonic incursions. But the great civil war it had spent years preparing would not happen. There would be no War Master leading half the legions against Terra. No brothers divided into two armies. No rebellion spreading across the Imperium before anyone understood what was happening. The Horus Heresy never began. Instead, the Imperium discovered the truth early enough to prepare. And that changed everything. The victory was not complete. Chaos had not been destroyed. Its servants were still hidden across the galaxy, and its influence remained stronger than the Imperium understood. But the greatest weapon Chaos possessed had been taken away from it. Ignorance. For centuries, humanity had believed the warp was merely a dangerous dimension. Now the Emperor knew better. Horus knew better. The Primarchs were beginning to know better. And somewhere within the Imperium, hidden enemies realized that their greatest secret was no longer safe. The heresy that should have shattered mankind had never begun. But the Imperium had discovered something far more dangerous. The enemy was real. And it had been inside humanity for centuries. The confrontation with Lorgar could no longer be delayed. The Emperor had gathered enough evidence to understand what the word-bearers had been doing, and the truth had become too dangerous to leave buried. Lorgar was summoned before his father, not as a condemned prisoner but as a Primarch being given one final opportunity to explain himself. Horus was present. So were several custodes and trusted Imperial officers. The atmosphere was tense, but there was still no declaration of war. The Emperor asked Lorgar a simple question. Why? Lorgar did not deny anything. He admitted that he had searched for gods beyond the material universe. He admitted that the word-bearers had performed rituals and communicated with entities within the warp. He spoke openly about his belief that humanity could not be reduced to the cold rationalism imposed by the imperial truth. The Emperor listened. Lorgar's anger grew as he spoke. He accused his father of creating a civilization without spiritual meaning, demanding that humanity abandon the very questions that had defined it for thousands of years. To Lorgar, the Imperium had conquered the galaxy while leaving mankind spiritually empty. He believed that humanity needed something greater to worship, something beyond flesh and empire. The Emperor answered that the beings Lorgar had found were not gods in the sense he imagined. They were predators. Lorgar rejected the answer. Then Erebus acted. The first chaplain had understood that the confrontation was not going in their favor. Lorgar was exposed. The word-bearers were being watched. Horus had survived Davin, and the Emperor now knew that the Legion had been touched by chaos. Erebus attempted to turn the confrontation into war. Hidden word-bearer forces activated their weapons. Imperial defenses responded. Before the first major exchange could begin, Horus arrived with loyal forces. The word-bearers found themselves surrounded. The realization spread rapidly through the Legion. They had prepared for a rebellion against the Imperium, but not for a confrontation in which the enemy already knew what they were planning. There was no surprise attack. No sudden betrayal from half the legions. No massive uprising across the galaxy. There were only the word-bearers. And the forces loyal to the Emperor. Some word-bearer officers refused to fight. They lowered their weapons rather than attack their own brothers. Some had followed Lorgar because they believed in him, not because they worshipped the entities he had discovered. Others finally understood what chaos had become inside their legion and wanted nothing to do with it. Others embraced it completely. They screamed praises to their new gods and attacked. The battlefield erupted. Bolters roared through the corridors. Astartes fought Astartes. The word-bearers turned their weapons against their own legion brothers, while loyal Imperial forces attempted to contain the violence before it spread beyond the confrontation. Then the warp opened. Demonic manifestations erupted across the battlefield. The air twisted. Reality cracked. Creatures poured through the breaches, expecting to find a battlefield prepared for them. Instead, they found the Slayer. He entered the conflict without waiting for orders. The first demon barely had time to react before it was destroyed. Then another fell. The Slayer moved through the battlefield with terrifying speed, eliminating the creatures as they emerged. Whenever a warp breach opened, he moved toward it. Whenever a demon attempted to escape into the surrounding structures, he followed. The battle became something the word-bearers had never anticipated. Their gods had answered their summons. But the gods had not come to save them. They had come because they saw an opportunity to spread their influence. Lorgar watched the Slayer tear through the creatures he had once believed were divine messengers. For the first time, doubt entered his mind. The entities he had worshipped had promised him enlightenment. They had promised that humanity could become something greater. They had promised that the word-bearers had been chosen. Yet now his legion was bleeding. His brothers were killing one another. And the gods did nothing to protect them. They simply watched. Lorgar finally understood the truth the Emperor had tried to tell him. They were not gods who loved their followers. They were powers that used them. But understanding did not mean surrender. Lorgar refused to submit. He fought his way through the collapsing battlefield while the word-bearers around him tore themselves apart. Loyalists attempted to surrender. Fanatics refused. Some died defending beliefs they no longer understood. Others killed their own brothers rather than abandon chaos. The Legion broke apart before the Emperor's forces could even finish defeating it. Horus reached Lorgar. For a moment, the two Primarchs stood facing one another. Horus had once considered him a brother who needed guidance. Now he saw something more complicated. Lorgar was not innocent. He had chosen this. He had opened the door. He had allowed the word-bearers to become servants of powers that cared nothing for them. Yet Lorgar still refused to surrender. The battle around them intensified. Lorgar eventually broke through the Imperial lines with a small group of his most devoted warriors. They escaped before the surrounding forces could close the final routes. Erebus was gone. No body was found. No trace remained except the lingering warp disturbance where he had disappeared. Horus stood among the ruins and watched the surviving word-bearers being disarmed. The rebellion had been crushed. Not across the galaxy. Not after years of civil war. Not through the destruction of Terra. It had been crushed here, before it could become the Heresy. But there was no celebration. Lorgar had escaped. Erebus was still somewhere in the darkness. And the word-bearers who had remained behind had revealed something the Primarchs could never forget. One of their brothers had willingly chosen chaos. The heresy had not happened. But the betrayal had begun. The defeat of the word-bearers forced the Emperor to confront an uncomfortable truth. Stopping one conspiracy would not protect the Imperium from the next. Chaos had not created every weakness within the Primarchs. It had simply found the wounds that already existed and learned how to press against them. If the Emperor wanted to prevent another catastrophe, he could no longer afford to look only for corrupted legions. He had to examine his sons themselves. The investigation began quietly. Every Primarch was evaluated. Their relationships were examined, their private grievances discussed and their interactions with the warp monitored more carefully than before. Some accepted the scrutiny. Others regarded it as another attempt by the Emperor to control them. Horus understood the reason behind it, but even he recognized the danger. The Primarchs were warriors, not prisoners, and treating them as potential traitors could create the very resentment Chaos wanted. The first major discovery came through Fulgrim. His campaign against the Lair had already produced strange reports, and Ferrus Manus noticed changes in his brother that others had dismissed. Fulgrim had become increasingly attached to a strange sword taken from the alien temple. He spoke of it with unusual admiration and refused to surrender it for examination. Ferrus confronted him. The conversation quickly became an argument. Fulgrim insisted that the weapon was simply an extraordinary piece of craftsmanship. Ferrus disagreed. He had spent his life studying weapons and machines, and there was something wrong with the blade that even he could not fully explain. Then the Slayer entered. He did not need to understand the weapon's construction. He recognized what was inside it. The presence surrounding the blade reacted violently when the Slayer approached. The room darkened, and a demonic entity attempted to manifest through Fulgrim's weapon. Fulgrim finally understood that his brother had been right. The Slayer attacked. Ferris joined him. Together they destroyed the presence before it could establish complete control over the Primarch. The blade shattered during the struggle, releasing a final burst of warp energy before collapsing into fragments. Fulgrim survived. But the experience left him shaken. He remembered the conversations he had once considered harmless. The thoughts that had slowly changed. The feeling that the blade understood him better than anyone else. He realized how close he had come to becoming something he would have hated. For perhaps the first time, Fulgrim looked at his own pride as a weakness. The discovery forced the Emperor to look toward the other Primarchs. Angron was the most obvious problem. The Red Angel remained furious. He had never forgiven the Emperor for taking him from his rebellion on Nysiria and forcing him into the Great Crusade. The fact that Chaos had once been capable of exploiting such anger was now impossible to ignore. The Emperor considered intervention. Sanguinius did something different. He approached Angron himself. The two Primarchs were opposites in almost every respect, yet Sanguinius understood that isolation would make Angron more vulnerable. He did not attempt to lecture him or defend the Emperor. He simply stayed close enough that Angron could not convince himself that every brother had abandoned him. Angron remained angry. But he was not alone. Mortarion presented another problem. His hatred of the Emperor was no longer treated as something that could simply be ignored. The resentment had existed since the moment they met, and the discovery of Chaos had only made its potential consequences more obvious. Mortarion openly questioned the Emperor's authority and refused to surrender his independence. He would fight beside the Imperium. He would not become its obedient servant. The Emperor accepted the distinction, even if he disliked it. Perturabo was more difficult. His bitterness remained buried beneath discipline and military obedience. He had spent years believing that his talents were used without appreciation and that his brothers received honors he had earned just as much. Nobody could simply remove those feelings from him. Guilliman argued that this was precisely the problem. The Imperium had been built around conquest, obedience, and the authority of the Emperor. It had never been designed to manage the psychological fractures of 18 Primarchs with different personalities, ambitions, and expectations. Guilliman began proposing structural reforms. Military authority needed clearer limits. Legion deployments needed greater transparency. Primarchs needed channels through which grievances could be addressed before they became resentments. Imperial institutions could not depend entirely upon personal loyalty. The Emperor listened. Some of his sons were surprised that he did. Others suspected that the reforms were simply another form of control. Then there was Magnus. The Crimson King remained fascinated by knowledge that the Emperor considered dangerous. The existence of Chaos had only intensified his curiosity. If the warp contained entities capable of influencing reality, Magnus wanted to understand how they worked. He believed knowledge itself was not evil and that refusing to study a threat could be more dangerous than studying it. The Emperor disagreed. Their arguments became increasingly frequent. Magnus continued exploring forbidden knowledge. The difference was that now everyone understood the danger. There would be no hidden enemy waiting for a single Primarch to fall. There would be no sudden revelation that Chaos existed only after the damage had already been done. The Imperium knew. The Primarchs knew. And that knowledge changed the balance. Yet the Emperor began to understand something more difficult than any battle. Demons could be killed. Rituals could be destroyed. Cult leaders could be executed. But the wounds inside his sons could not be eliminated with a weapon. Fulgrim had nearly fallen because of pride. Angron carried a lifetime of rage. Mortarion carried hatred. Perturabo carried resentment. Magnus carried dangerous curiosity. Others carried weaknesses that had not yet been exposed. The heresy had been prevented, but the conditions that could have created it had not vanished. The Emperor had spent centuries preparing humanity to survive external enemies. Now he realized that saving his sons from chaos required something far more difficult. He had to understand them. Because the greatest threat was no longer simply the enemy beyond the veil. It was the fracture within the family itself. The heresy had been prevented. The fractures that created it had not disappeared. After the destruction of the Word-Bearers' rebellion, Erebus became the most wanted traitor in the Imperium. Unlike Lorgar, he had no legions standing behind him and no desire to negotiate. He disappeared into the darkness before Imperial forces could capture him, taking with him knowledge of the hidden cults and warp networks that had been built during years of preparation. The Emperor wanted him found. Horus wanted him found. But the Slayer did not wait for orders. He began hunting. Erebus moved constantly. He abandoned one sanctuary after another, traveling through hidden warp passages and ancient fortresses that had been prepared long before the Davin campaign. Every location contained another piece of the network he had created. Secret altars. Forbidden texts. Weapons contaminated by the warp. Human cultists who had spent years waiting for instructions that would never come. The Slayer destroyed them all. At the first fortress, the cultists attempted to summon a demon before he could reach their leader. The ritual lasted only seconds before the Slayer tore through the chamber and destroyed the summoning circle. At another site, he found an entire community that had been secretly converted to chaos. They fought desperately when he arrived, believing their gods would protect them. They did not. The Slayer continued from world to world. Every abandoned fortress revealed another part of Erebus's network. Every hidden chamber demonstrated how deeply the Word-Bearers had penetrated Imperial territory. There were governors who had accepted forbidden promises, officers who had carried messages for cults and civilians who had unknowingly become part of rituals whose purpose they could not understand. The Slayer did not stop to judge them. He followed the trail. Erebus began sending champions to delay him. Chaos warriors emerged from warp breaches. Demons were unleashed in groups large enough to overwhelm entire Imperial squads. Mutated Astartes ambushed the Slayer in ruined cities and ancient temples. Some were powerful enough to challenge Space Marines for hours. None stopped him for long. One champion managed to wound him deeply enough to slow his advance. The Slayer disappeared into the smoke, and the Chaos Warrior believed he had finally achieved what others could not. Then the Slayer returned. The champion died without understanding how. Another attempted to trap him beneath a fortress as the structure collapsed around them. The Slayer escaped through the ruins and continued walking. Every attempt only delayed Erebus. It never saved him. Eventually, Erebus retreated to a world that no Imperial map recorded. It was a demon world. The planet had once belonged to humanity, but centuries of warp corruption had transformed it into something unrecognizable. Mountains twisted into impossible shapes. Rivers flowed upward into the sky. The surface itself seemed to breathe. Around its central fortress, enormous structures had been built from warp energy, forming walls that shifted between stone, metal, and living flesh. Erebus believed the world could protect him. He was no longer relying upon deception. He summoned everything available to him. Demons gathered around the fortress in numbers that could have overwhelmed a legion. Greater entities stood beside lesser creatures. Chaos champions arrived from the warp to defend the man who had promised them victory. Then the Slayer arrived. He walked across the dead landscape alone. The demons attacked. The battle lasted for hours. The Slayer fought through everything the demon world could throw at him. He crossed fields of fire, destroyed towers made from corrupted energy and fought creatures that had existed long before the Imperium was born. Every step brought him closer to the fortress. Erebus watched from within. For the first time, he understood that he had made a mistake. He had spent years believing that every enemy could be manipulated. The Emperor could be deceived. Primarchs could be exploited. Legions could be turned. Humanity could be convinced. Even Horus could be corrupted. But the Slayer had never offered him an opening. When the final defenses collapsed, Erebus stood before him. The first chaplain looked at the armored warrior and tried one last weapon. Words. You think killing me changes anything? The Slayer said nothing. Erebus continued. Chaos does not need me. If I die, another will rise. Another cult will appear. Another man will open the door. You cannot kill an idea. The Slayer continued walking. Erebus stepped backward. You have spent your entire existence fighting hell. Has it ever ended? Has killing one demon ever stopped another from appearing? The Slayer stopped. For a moment, Erebus thought he had finally reached something inside him. Then the Slayer continued forward. Erebus understood. The argument meant nothing. The Slayer had never believed that killing one enemy would end the war. He killed enemies because they were in front of him. And Erebus was standing in front of him. The word-bearer retreated toward the final chamber. Behind him stood a massive warp gate, already beginning to activate. Erebus had prepared it as his final escape route. He reached for the controls. The Slayer moved faster. He crossed the chamber before the gate could fully open. Erebus froze. There was nowhere else to go. For the first time in his life, the man who had manipulated kings, priests, warriors, and primarchs found himself facing someone he could not deceive. He tried anyway. You do not understand what you are fighting. The Slayer raised his weapon. I understand enough. Erebus stared at him. There was no negotiation left. No bargain. No hidden weakness. No desire to exploit. No fear to weaponize. Nothing. The Slayer fired. Erebus died before the warp gate could open. The fortress began collapsing around him as the energies holding the demon world together destabilized. The creatures that had gathered to protect their servant began disappearing into the warp. The Slayer walked away. The architect of the heresy was dead. He had spent years preparing the greatest civil war humanity would ever know. He had manipulated the word-bearers. He had helped poison Horus. He had built the foundations of a rebellion that should have consumed the Imperium. But he never saw the war. He never watched Terra burn. He never saw the legions divided. He never witnessed Horus turn against the Emperor. The heresy had died before it began. And the man who had spent years creating it died alone on a world that should never have existed. The architect of the heresy was gone. But chaos remained. The death of Erebus did not bring peace. It simply forced chaos to abandon the war it had spent years preparing. The dark gods had lost their greatest opportunity. Horus remained loyal, the legions had not divided, and Terra stood untouched. The timetable that had once promised the destruction of the Imperium was now useless. Chaos changed its strategy. If one rebellion could not destroy humanity, then thousands of smaller wars would have to do the work instead. Across the galaxy, hidden cults began rising. Some worlds experienced sudden uprisings against imperial authority. Governors disappeared. Astropaths began reporting voices that did not belong to any known signal. Entire populations turned against their commanders after generations of secret corruption finally erupted into open violence. Then the demons came. Warp breaches appeared with increasing frequency. A peaceful city could become a battlefield in minutes. A military base could suddenly find itself surrounded by creatures that had never existed in real space before. Imperial forces learned quickly that ordinary weapons and conventional tactics were not always enough. Assassinations became another weapon. Primarchs were targeted. Senior commanders were targeted. Astropaths, navigators, and Imperial officials were killed before they could identify the source of the attacks. Chaos no longer needed to conquer entire worlds. It only needed to remove the people holding those worlds together. Expeditionary fleets became especially vulnerable. Thousands of vessels operated far from Terra, sometimes without direct communication for months. Cults infiltrated crews. Officers disappeared. Entire units began receiving false orders. In several cases, Chaos managed to corrupt isolated fleets before Imperial authorities even realized that something had gone wrong. The Imperium could no longer pretend that these incidents were unrelated. The truth had to be acknowledged. The existence of Chaos was revealed to the highest levels of Imperial command, and eventually the knowledge spread further. The Imperial truth could no longer remain unchanged. Humanity had to be taught that the warp contained intelligent entities capable of manipulating reality and corrupting human minds. The revelation caused fear. Some worlds descended into panic. Others reacted with religious fanaticism. Some governors attempted to hide the truth from their populations. But ignorance was no longer considered an acceptable defense. The Great Crusade began changing. The objective was no longer simply to conquer every human world and bring it into the Imperium. Every conquered world now had to be protected from the warp. Every fleet needed specialized anti-demonic forces. Every military commander required knowledge of corruption. Every astropathic network had to be monitored for signs of intrusion. The Crusade was becoming something else. A permanent war against the Imperium. The Emperor accelerated his preparations for Terra. The threat of a psychic catastrophe could no longer be treated as a distant possibility. The defenses surrounding the throne world were strengthened, hidden passages were secured, and enormous resources were redirected toward protecting the heart of the Imperium from warp incursions. The Emperor understood that the enemy would eventually try to reach Terra. The difference was that now he was preparing for it. Horus became central to the new strategy. The War Master had survived the attempt to corrupt him, and that experience changed the way he commanded. He began developing an entirely new military doctrine based on the assumption that Chaos could infiltrate an army long before it attacked openly. Legions were taught to identify corruption. Command structures were redesigned to prevent a single compromised officer from controlling an entire force. Expeditionary fleets were required to maintain independent communication channels. Demonic outbreaks were no longer treated as impossible anomalies. They became expected threats. Horus understood something that few others did. Chaos did not need to defeat an army on the battlefield. It only needed to make the army destroy itself. Sanguinius took command of some of the most dangerous campaigns. His legion was repeatedly deployed against major warp incursions, and his presence became a symbol of resistance on worlds that had already witnessed demonic attacks. Unlike the wars of the Great Crusade, these campaigns were not always fought against armies that could be negotiated with or conquered. Sometimes the enemy could only be destroyed. Sanguinius learned to fight a different kind of war. Guilliman worked on another front. He began pushing reforms through the Imperium, arguing that the new threat required stronger institutions rather than simply greater military power. Worlds needed clear defensive protocols. Legions needed independent oversight. Commanders needed the authority to act when corruption was suspected without waiting for orders from Terra. The Imperium was becoming more complicated. But it was also becoming harder to deceive. And then there was the Slayer. Wherever a major demonic outbreak occurred, his name began appearing in reports. A city consumed by warp entities. The Slayer arrived. A fortress overtaken by demons. The Slayer arrived. A fleet trapped inside a warp storm. Eventually, the Slayer arrived there too. He became something the Imperium had never possessed before, a weapon that required no command structure, no political authority, and no explanation. He did not lead armies. He did not govern worlds. He did not accept rank. He simply appeared where hell had opened its door. And then the door closed. Imperial soldiers began telling stories about him. Some claimed he could sense demons before they manifested. Others said that entire armies of chaos had been destroyed after he entered a battlefield alone. Many stories were exaggerated. None were entirely false. The dark gods had lost the heresy. They had failed to turn Horus. They had failed to divide the Primarchs. They had failed to besiege Terra. But they had discovered something else. The Imperium was no longer blind. The war had changed. Humanity had learned that chaos was not a myth, not a superstition, and not an abstract danger hidden beyond the stars. It was real. It was intelligent. It was patient. And it was coming. There was no siege of Terra. There was no traitor warmaster. There was no civil war tearing the legions apart. Instead, humanity entered a war that had no single battlefield and no final victory. The Great Crusade had ended in everything but name. A new age had begun. An age in which mankind finally knew what was waiting in the darkness. And somewhere beyond that darkness, the gods of chaos were already searching for another way. Years passed after the destruction of the conspiracy that should have become the Horus Heresy. The Imperium survived, but it was no longer the same civilization that had begun the Great Crusade. The discovery of chaos had forced humanity to become more vigilant, more disciplined, and far more militarized. Every world understood that the greatest threats might not arrive in fleets. Sometimes they could already be hiding among the population. Horus remained Warmaster. The title that chaos had intended to turn into a symbol of betrayal instead became the foundation of the Imperium's new military doctrine. He continued leading the Great Crusade while directing the growing war against the warp. His relationship with the Emperor was not perfect. The secrets revealed on Davin had not simply vanished, and Horus still questioned decisions he would once have accepted without hesitation. But their disagreements were now spoken openly. Sanguinius remained alive. Ferrus Manus remained at his side. The future that had once promised their deaths had been denied before it could begin. Fulgrim survived as well, but he carried the memory of the SLAYER blade with him. He rarely spoke about how close he had come to losing himself. The experience had changed his relationship with pride, and his brothers noticed the difference. Fulgrim was still Fulgrim, still ambitious and still obsessed with perfection, but now he understood that corruption did not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it whispered. Angron remained loyal, though loyalty was never the same as forgiveness. His hatred of the Emperor continued to burn beneath the surface, and their relationship remained one of the most difficult within the Imperium. Yet Angron had not been given to chaos. He fought for humanity because he had chosen to continue fighting, even if he refused to pretend that he loved the man who had taken him from Nysiria. Mortarion remained equally difficult. He distrusted the Emperor and refused to surrender his independence. But he understood what chaos represented now. His hatred did not turn him into a traitor. Instead, it became another tension that the Imperium had to manage without allowing it to become a weapon for the enemy. Perturabo continued serving. His resentment remained unresolved, but Guilliman's reforms had given him greater authority and recognition. It did not make him happy. It did not erase years of bitterness. But it removed some of the conditions that chaos had once planned to exploit. Magnus was another matter. The Crimson King continued exploring forbidden knowledge, convinced that understanding the warp was essential to defeating it. His experiments became increasingly dangerous, and even the Emperor began to wonder how long curiosity could remain separate from arrogance. Chaos was still waiting. It had lost the heresy, but it had not lost the galaxy. Cult movements continued appearing. Demonic incursions remained a constant threat. Agents of the Dark Gods searched for weaknesses among humanity, studying every Primarch, every commander, and every world for another opportunity. But now the Imperium was watching. And wherever chaos appeared, another name increasingly followed. The Slayer. Imperial soldiers had turned him into a living legend. Some claimed that he had fought entire armies alone. Others said that demons could sense him from across the warp and fled before he arrived. New recruits heard stories about the silent warrior who had appeared from another reality and refused every rank offered to him. The truth was simpler. He fought. He killed demons. Then he moved on. He never remained long enough to become a symbol by choice. He never established a fortress. He never demanded followers. He never accepted command of a legion. To the Imperium, this made him almost impossible to understand. Eventually, the Emperor summoned him back to Terra. The Slayer arrived without ceremony. He walked through the Imperial Palace beneath the watch of custodes who had once regarded him as a potential threat. Years had changed their opinion. They still did not completely understand him, but they had witnessed enough of his actions to know that the stranger had never turned his weapons against humanity. The Emperor waited for him. For a long time, neither spoke. The Emperor had once asked what the Slayer would do if he discovered his old enemy in this galaxy. The answer had been obvious. Now the Emperor offered him something different. A permanent place within the Imperium. A position. Resources. Authority. Whatever he required to continue his war. The Slayer refused. The Emperor was not surprised. "You were never fighting for us," he said. The Slayer remained silent. "You were fighting because they were there." The Slayer looked toward the distant doors of the chamber. The Emperor understood. The Slayer did not belong to the Imperium. He had never belonged to the Imperium. He had simply recognized the enemy before anyone else knew its name. The Emperor allowed him to leave. Once again, the Slayer walked away from Terra. No ceremony followed. No title was granted. No statue was raised. He simply disappeared into the vastness of the Imperium, following another report of a warp breach somewhere beyond the borders of human space. Horus remained War Master. Sanguinius remained alive. Ferrus Manus remained beside his brothers. The legions remained united. The Emperor remained upon Terra. The siege that should have destroyed humanity never happened. The heresy that should have divided the Primarchs never began. But the war against chaos continued. And somewhere, on another world beneath another poisoned sky, demons were gathering. Imperial forces were already preparing to respond. Then something moved through the darkness. A lone warrior walked toward the battlefield. He was never a Primarch. Never an Astartes. Never a servant. He was simply a warrior who recognized hell when everyone else called it something else. And because he had arrived at the right moment, the greatest betrayal in human history never happened. The Slayer disappeared into the next war. And the galaxy learned to fear the sound of his approach. There was no siege of Terra. The Emperor never became a corpse upon the Golden Throne. Horus never turned against his father. Sanguinius never died aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Ferrus Manus never fell on Istvan. The legions never divided themselves beneath the banners of brother against brother. The galaxy remained dangerous. Chaos remained eternal. And mankind remained imperfect. But history had changed. The heresy that should have shattered humanity became a war that never happened. Not because the Emperor was omniscient. Not because Horus was incorruptible. Not because chaos had been defeated. It happened because one warrior from another reality recognized the enemy before it was too late. He had never wanted a throne. He had never asked for a legion. He had never sought worship, glory, or even a place within the Imperium. He only knew one thing. Hell had followed him. And wherever hell appeared, he would be there. Far beyond the borders of the Imperium, a warp breach opened above a forgotten world. Something ancient moved within the darkness. A demon screamed. Then came silence. From the edge of the breach, a familiar green-armored silhouette emerged. The Slayer raised his weapon and ran toward hell once again.